You're listening to the Based on History podcast.
All units, Irene. I say again, Irene.
And we're going to kick him in the ass. We're going to kick the hell out of him all the time. And we're going to go through him like crap through a goose.
You tell him I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me! That they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom! Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
Howdy everyone, welcome back to the Based on History podcast, and we're doing a Based on History mini today that's going to cover the weapons, armor, and tactics of the movie 300. So we're going to talk mainly about the Spartans and kind of Greeks in general, and then we'll kind of move on to the Persians after that. So, just to kind of back reference, this is all taking place in 480 BC. So when we're talking about these types of armor and types of weapons and tactics and things like that, just keep in mind that these are all taking place in a much, much earlier time period than even like Alexander the Great, especially the Romans and things like that. And so when we talk about them, there's not as many historical artifacts for certain pieces that have been found and that remain or that remain in good condition. So some of these are historians and archaeologists' best guesses, and especially dealing with tactics and certain types of armor and things like that. So we'll just dive right into it, and we're going to start with the Spartans and the Greeks, and we'll start with their weapons. And the main weapon of the Spartans and the Spartan hoplites at this time, or Greek hoplites in general, would be their spear, and that's called the dory. And at this time, it's going to be somewhere between 6 and 10 feet long. It's going to weigh about 4 pounds, and it's going to be about 2 inches wide. The shaft is going to be about 2 inches wide. It's got an iron-tipped spearhead, and then we talked about it before in one of the podcasts about the lizarder, the counterweight, and for killing wounded soldiers on the ground as they march. And that's going to be on the backside of the spear. The spear itself develops over the course of Greek history, and then you really see it coming to be a different type of spear with Alexander's Macedonians and how they really, really lengthen the spear, and then also how they kind of have smaller shields. It was surprising to me that this spear is only 2 inches wide, and I just kind of picture it in my mind as being a heavier spear. But as far as width is concerned, it's pretty thin, and that just allows them to wield it easier. It's going to be lighter, all of those sorts of things. And the main wood that they would have used to make these is ash. Ash is a very strong wood. You see it in all sorts of kind of polearm production and things like that. And the spear is by far the most important offensive weapon that the hoplite has. Once again, the hoplite is heavy infantry, and the Greek city-states at this time, that is all that they are fielding on the field of battle. So it is all revolving around this singular type of troop, the hoplite. And the spear is what allows them to have ranged offensive capabilities, because they don't have any archers. They're not really fielding slingers or anything like that. So we'll get to it in a second. They do carry swords and knives on them, but that is a close quarters weapon. You're up close and personal when you're using the type of sword and the knife that they carry. And the spear allows them to have the more or less capability of the sword, but lengthen and keep their opponents at bay. And that's kind of what revolves around. Now we'll move on to the sword that they carry, and that's called the Zephos, and it's a short sword. It is not like an English knight sword, or it is a secondary weapon, and that is what it is meant for. It's a secondary when your spear has broken, or for whatever reason you lost it, then you can revert back to your sword. The other capability that the sword gave them was to be able to do quick thrusts through the gaps in their shield wall into the more lightly armored opponents or enemies that they're facing. And this would have been done by kind of the rear rank going through the gap and things like that. I don't know how often that was a tactic or how standardized that tactic was. We just know that did happen from time to time. And talking about the Zephos, the Spartans themselves used shorter swords than most of or the rest of the Greek city-states, and they think it was specifically for that purpose of going through the gaps in the shields or underneath them to where the legs are less armored than the chest and the helmet and everything like that. And having a longer sword was actually more unwieldy behind a Spartan phalanx than the shorter one, and it allowed them to maneuver it easier within the confines of the Spartan phalanx. And so these are all kind of general numbers of the artifacts that they found and things of that nature, but generally speaking, the Greek city-states, their swords are roughly 60 centimeters in length. And from what they have found, the Spartan's sword was more along the lines of the 45 centimeter length, so quite a bit shorter. And you can see how having a shorter sword would be more advantageous when you're all bunched up much, much tighter, and then especially when the enemy comes to blows and you're holding a shield and you can just kind of do quick thrusts through the gaps or underneath and things like that. The Zephos is an iron short sword. It's going to be double-edged, and honestly, I think it kind of looks like a stereotypical, like if a child drew a sword, it's not a fancy looking sword. Now, when I mean not fancy, they still put gold and jewels and emblems and things like that on it to make it quote unquote fancy. But the way it looks, it's just a very, just like a cross. And there's no design features that are outlandish, or when you would see like, oh yeah, that's the way the Greeks curved it, or that's the way, I don't exactly know what I'm trying to say other than that it's kind of a no frills short sword. It's double edged. It's got a hilt and handle, and that's pretty much it. And that's what they used it for. It's a tool of war. Now we'll move on to the helmet, and the helmet there's always some controversy as to what type of helmets were they wearing at this point in time or that point in time, and when did this helmet go out of fashion? When did this helmet come into fashion and things like that? And the answer is kind of that it's all blended together, because the Spartan hoplite, like all Greek hoplites, supplied their own armor. And so when the soldiers are required to supply their own, they're going to bring many different things upon the battlefield. And that is going to be due to a number of factors of what technology is available at the time, what's in fashion at the time, which you still see in soldiers today, of what looks cool and what they like, and that's always changing. And conventional soldiers see special forces wearing something, and then like, oh man, that's really cool, now I want to wear it, and it kind of trickles down, and then you kind of see the kind of military fashion change depending on what looks cool and what they like. It also has to do with how much money the individual soldier themselves has, because if you're a poorer farmer and you're being called up to go and fight for these city-states, you're not going to be able to afford something that a higher class, aristocrat or something along those lines can afford. So you may not have the top of the line bronze this, the top of the line iron that, or the newest, latest breastplate and things. And so the level of armor and helmets and everything that they would have it would be completely hodgepodge, so to speak. It would be different from soldier to soldier, and some would be the same as this guy, and some would be different from the other one. So when talking specifically about the helmets, when you think of Greek hoplites, you really think of that Corinthian-style helmet, that super famous one that you see in all the pottery and you see in all of the movies. And when talking about the movie 300, the helmets that they wear are a fantasy version of a helmet that did actually exist, and it does resemble the helmet that they wore, but it would have been kind of a later period Corinthian helmet. Corinthian helmet's super cool. It's got these big, long cheek pieces that kind of come down to a point, narrow eye slits, a nose piece. A lot of them have the crested helm, whether that be in bronze or horsehair coming through it and things like that. And they adorned it in any way they kind of wanted to. And it gives it a very kind of ominous look. And it's twofold. One, it does do that. It kind of is intimidating on the battlefield. But also they're looking for something that is going to provide as much protection as possible. And when you're in a phalanx, the only things that are showing are kind of your legs from the knees down and the top part of your head. So your eyes are above the shield, obviously, so that you can see what's going on. But they want as much protection with still being able to see as possible. And so those cheek pieces are going to come down, and the brow's going to come down really low. And at the time of 480 BC, the Corinthian helmet itself is really starting to go out of fashion in the Greek city-states. Now, we know that some soldiers were still using the Corinthian helmet through this period and even to a little bit later dates. So, this is just my opinion, but I guarantee you probably would have seen Corinthian helmets at the Battle of Thermopylae and, some of the later battles. But you also would have seen the kind of more traditional historical helmet that does semi-resemble what they wear in the movie. And then you also would have seen a helmet that, the best way I can describe it is that it looks very similar to the kind of stereotypical Roman legionary helmet. And it's kind of got that round helm, and then it's got kind of the cheek pieces that hang down on little hinges with a more open face. And when you look at some of these Greek city-state helmets, they look very similar to those Roman helmets, but they're made out of bronze, and they don't have kind of the helm brow piece and a few other of the little, changes. It's more of a primitive version of the Roman legionary helmet at that time. But we know that the Spartans wore this type of helmet, and a lot of them would have been wearing that helmet at Thermopylae. It just wouldn't have been as uniform as you see in movies or books and in descriptions of that. So now we kind of move on to the breastplate that the Spartans would have been wearing. And there's really two types of breastplates that you would have seen at the Battle of Thermopylae. There could have been more. Some may not have even been wearing breastplates. Like I said, it's all supplied by the individual, so it would have been varying. But the two by and large that you would have seen are the bronze breastplate, which is called the panoply, and the lenothorax. And the panoply is bronze, and so that's kind of like your stereotypical Greek-looking Roman centurion-esque, one piece or two pieces put together. It's going to have the ribs and the pecs, or horses or wolves or whatever is adorned on it, but it's going to be made out of metal, and it's usually going to be made out of bronze. The lenothorax, which we talked a little bit about in the other podcast, is a linen armor that they're not 100% sure of what it actually is. We know that it's described by Homer, it's described by Plutarch, it's described by a bunch of historians, but never in real detail. And we have some mosaics, and we have some paintings, and we see it on pottery. So we know what it looked like. And we know that it evolved over time from being linen to incorporating scales, to incorporating metal, and varying degrees of both of those things. But we just don't really know how they constructed it. And this is mainly because we know that it was made out of some type of linen or cloth, and those things are biodegradable. So through hundreds of years and thousands of years, these things disappeared just through the biodegrading process. And so we don't really have any archaeological finds to say, oh, look, they found the lenothorax in Sparta in an archaeological dig. There's nothing like that. So we have to rely on the limited descriptions that we have from historians that are not really focusing on the description of the armor in their tales, And then the art, which is always kind of historical and fanciful all at the same time. So there's interpretation that kind of goes into that. But the lenothorax is a single piece construction that is you're going to kind of put it on like a vest, but the vest has been cut on the side. So you kind of slide into it, and then it ties around the ribs. And then it's got these two shoulder pieces that fold over and then tie either in a one-piece knot in the center or down on both sides over the pecs on the two little kind of hooks that you would tie these leather strings onto. And we're pretty sure that Alexander at the Battle of Gaugamela was wearing some type of lenothorax, described as he was wearing a double-layer lenothorax in the famous mosaic of Alexander. You see him wearing one on his horse as he's charging the Persian lines. And there's different types of these, and like I said, they evolve over time. It's a pretty cool ancient piece of history that's kind of not lost because we know it existed, but there's no real findings of it. And so we may never know what the lenothorax actually is. And there have been a lot of people who have tried to reconstruct it. There was a college professor, I believe, in Wisconsin with his student, and they glued strips of linen together on top of each other to create a lenothorax, and they shot arrows at it, and it deflected them very well, and the penetration wasn't very deep and things like that. But there's no real description of using glue in these, and that doesn't mean to say that they didn't, because there's been ancient types of glue and resin used throughout history, but we know that it's not described in any of the historical facts that we have found. It's not described that they use glue. It's layered or sewn or, those types of things. And so I don't mean to say that's wrong. I just mean to say there's no evidence yet to say that they used glue, some type of glue or resin, to make the lenothorax. All right. I think that covers the lenothorax pretty good. There's tons of information. I think it's super cool. But we'll move on to the shields now. The shield that the Spartans would have been wearing, the shields that the Spartans would have been using during this time would have been made out of wood. And then they would have had a bronze covering over it with some type of fabric on the inside so that it wouldn't wear or rub on your arm or hand while you were using it. And the emblem that you see, especially like in a lot of history books and things like that, always has the emblem of the city-state on it. And they did use those, but mainly in later dates and times. When you see like the Spartan lambda or other things of that nature. During this time, some of them very well could have had the Spartan lambda on the shield, but it would have been varying. They wouldn't have all been exactly the same. They would have had house emblems and clan emblems and city emblems and all sorts of different things, just to kind of individualize the soldier himself. Because that is think of it kind of like World War II bomber paint. Each plane has a different type of art on the nose of the B-17 bombers, and that is specific to that crew, and it inspires them, it gives them hope. It's part of their story, it's part of their tale, something that they can rally behind. And these shields would have been very similar to that. The soldier would have put something on there that meant something to him, that he could look at and say, that's my family's emblem, and I'm fighting for my family, or I'm fighting for my city, or this or that kind of a thing. And the lambda serves that same purpose. It just wouldn't have been so standardized. So now we'll move on to the tactics of the Spartans. And the tactics of the Spartans would have been the phalanx. And the phalanx is essentially a shield wall with long spears sticking out the front. And you would have usually had the front row with their shields interlocked with their spears over the top, and they would have been holding it underhand so that they could jab it down on their opponents. And then you would have had the second rank with their spears over the top as well, being able to thrust out. And then as you got farther back, you would see that the ranks had their spears held upright, and then they would either rotate into the front when people got tired, or if somebody fell in battle, the next person in that rank would take his spot to close that gap. And the men in the back rank would be using the Lizarder to dispatch any wounded soldiers that are on the ground as they were beginning to push and move forward. The whole point of the phalanx is to be interlocked and to support the other the person on your left. And so what this did, it gave to what's known as the right push, or the whole entire formation would drift to the right because your shield is protecting the person on your left. And so everybody is kind of moving to their right to get further behind the shield of the person next to them. And so the whole formation would generally shift to the right. And sometimes they both, if it was Greek on Greek, they would be fighting as the whole formation turned in a circle. The whole entire formation is very, very strong on its own, but it's not very good when if the Greek phalanx gets outflanked, it's done. It's going to be wiped out, and that's the whole point of kind of what these formations are trying to do to each other, as if it was Greek on phalanx, is they're trying to get into that flank where they're not very protected. So it's very, very, very heavily protected on the front, but on the sides and the rear, there's not much. It's also not extremely flexible, because as soon as you start trying to maneuver your troops, if they're not maneuvering all in unison, gaps start to form. And once a gap forms in the phalanx, the enemy can penetrate into it, cut off sections, and then defeat the phalanx. So the phalanx was always trying to find good flat ground to fight on, with some type of usually natural formation to help guard one of their flanks, whether that be like a river or a hill, mountainside. And we see that at Thermopylae. That is what they do. They get there and they've got the sea on one side and they've got the mountains on the other. And then they've got kind of a very thin, narrow, flat plain, which allows them to maneuver easily as a phalanx formation, but keep their flanks secure from the Persian forces. And that's really where the strength of the Spartans at Thermopylae comes into play. Okay, now we'll move on to the Persians, and we won't spend a ton of time on them, especially on their weapons and armor, but we'll talk a little bit about their tactics. But first we'll cover what they were wearing and what they were using. Most of the Persian forces are wearing quilted armor, so some type of fabric that's been woven together to be stronger than just regular fabric. We know that the Immortals had armor, there was some type of scale armor of that kind of nature, so they did have more heavily armored troops than just this quilted, but generally speaking, most of the forces are going to be lightly armored, and they're coming from all over the Persian Empire at this time, and they're not wearing the Persian-issued quilted armor. They're wearing whatever they bring from home, whether that be, tanned animal hides or nothing at all, or their own iron, scaled armor, whatnot. You would see tons and tons and tons of different types of armor, from almost nothing to this quilted armor that's described in history, to some type of scale armor, bronze armor of that nature. Their shields are going to be mainly wicker shields, which is just, if you've ever seen like a wicker chair, it's hardened leaf or, strips of wood that's been dried out and woven together to make it tougher. And this really has to do with, they absorb arrows very well, but they're not really going to hold up to the pushing and shoving match that you get into with a Greek phalanx, or a massive spear thrust, or a sword going through it. That's not what it's designed for. The spear that the Persians are using is a much shorter spear. I wouldn't call it a javelin, but it's a much shorter spear. And it's really there to, help just defend the archers as they fire, or loose, as you say in the archery community, and then to engage the enemy while the cavalry maneuvers around to the flank or the rear. So it was not meant to be a heavy combat infantry shield. And when it came to blows with the Spartans and Greek phalanxes in general, it didn't hold up. It couldn't hold up to the kind of pushing match when a bronze-covered heavy shield and spear are being pushed up against it, and it was ineffective. The main thing of the Persian army at this time is the bows. We talked about it in the episode. We talked about it in the Ionian Revolt episode. It's massive and massive and massive amounts of bow fire. If you listen to like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, he does a whole series on the Greco-Persian Wars, and he talks about the numbers of arrows that they would have fired in like an hour with a general-sized Persian army, and it was like in the millions. It was in the millions. So when they say our arrows blot out the sun, with one volley of arrows, they could have blotted out the sun in that area or over the enemy that they were firing. So it was a kind of a boast, but there's some truth to it with the number of arrows that they're going to fire at you. But what we know from history is that the Persian arrow fire was completely ineffective against the Greek hoplites, not just at Thermopylae, but almost every time they were engaged. Now, I'm not saying that they weren't wounded or people weren't killed, but as a formation and as a tactic on the battlefield against the Greek hoplites, it was ineffective. And that has to do with the armor that they're wearing. The Persian army is used to fighting lightly armored troops in the Persian sphere of, scope of dominance. And a lot of desert, hot weather, the tribes that they're fighting are all going to be more or less lightly armored. And then they come to the Greeks and they are fully armored for that time and age. They're wearing, braces on their arms. They're wearing greaves on their shins. They've got bronze helmets that cover their entire head and face. They've got these massive shields that cover their entire front. Then they've got a massive, massive breastplate that's stopping arrows. And the bow, which was the main thing in the Persian, when that's ineffective, you have to rely on the men in the lightly armored quilted armor with the short spears that can't reach as well. And then, of course, your cavalry. And we know that at the Battle of Thermopylae, the cavalry played a very, very little part. One, because they might not have even been there. They might have been out scouting and doing stuff like that. But they also, regardless, did not have the room to maneuver that cavalry needs to be effective in a battle. The Hot Gates has the mountains and the sea plus a wall. So not only can they not get around the rear, even if they did, there's a wall that would block them from being able to get into the rear of the Spartan phalanx. So now we'll talk about the Persian tactics as a whole, and then kind of what I said. We know that they were ineffective at the Battle of Thermopylae due to the terrain, and the Persian military is a combined arms. I mean, I talked about it in the Ionian Revolt episode. It's the Persians, and then later like the Macedonians and the Romans, are as close to the way a modern army operates as you can almost get. Especially like the U.S. military, we're going to use air power, armor, combined with infantry and artillery, all in unison, helping each other. That's what combined arms is. And they have the bow, they have the shield wall and the spear, they have the cavalry, they have a very strong navy, and they have great supply lines. They are operating far from their home base. The Greeks are on their front doorstep, essentially. They are almost home. They're fighting in their homeland. The Persians are months away from the capital, and some of these forces have come even farther than that, and yet we never read about Persian supply problems, especially in the initial phases of the operations. They are going to form a wall so that you can't get to them. They are going to pin you down with massive and massive amounts of arrow fire, and then they are going to get into your flanks and rear with their cavalry. And that's what the Persians are known for, and they're really, really, really good at it. So when you see the terrain at Thermopylae, you understand how the Persians didn't work here. And later on, there's some other reasons why the Persian army is not able to defeat the Greeks on a more open field, a battle plane. But here specifically, it's the first major battle in this war. And now the Persians are victorious, and we talked about it in the episode. They are able to eventually get around behind them, and the Spartans are eventually put down with a lot of bow fire, but it's at a much closer range. They're wounded. They're exhausted from multiple days of fighting and things of that nature. But generally speaking, they had to adapt their normal tactics to be able to defeat the Spartans at Thermopylae because nothing worked. Day after day, they tried their tactics of sending in the spearmen, launching tons of arrows, and it just didn't work. And they couldn't use their cavalry. And when you've beaten everybody all the time, over and over and over again with this tactic, and then all of a sudden it's not working, I'm sure it was confusing. And it's kind of credit to the Persians that they were able to scout and get reports and find this path and get around and change their tactics to be able to defeat somebody on terrain that they're not used to against a force with armor that they're not used to fighting. So it's kind of a credit to the Persians, almost more so than to the Spartans. But credit to the Spartans for figuring out, hey, we're fighting a much larger force. We need to funnel them down. And we need to have barriers to negate the things that they're really, really good at. And we do that with the armor. We do that with the terrain, and we're fighting on home field advantage. So that kind of covers the weapons, armor, and tactics for the movie 300. It's we didn't dive too deep in. I just wanted to hit some things and just talk a little bit more about this point in time in this movie. So don't forget to follow us on Instagram. Check us out on YouTube. Check us out on all of our platforms, from Spotify to Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast. We really appreciate it. Follow us. Hit the subscribe button. Appreciate all the support we've gotten. We appreciate all the support from everybody who's been telling everybody, and the feedback we've been getting. I can't tell you how much I appreciate all of it. So until next time, adios.